The journey has been long and the path difficult, but the final resolution is finally within your reach at the end. Stay with us as we piece together the last bit of the puzzle to reveal the truth. Hit subscribe now and witness the most important ending today.
On my 64th birthday, my son called from Seattle to ask whether the $6,000 his wife deposited into my account every month was enough to cover my dialysis treatments. I was sitting at my kitchen table eating reheated soup when he asked, and I set my spoon down very carefully before I answered. "Son," I said, "what money?" The silence on his end lasted long enough that I checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "My name is Raymond Holt. I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant for the federal government, tracking financial fraud in cases that took years to build and seconds to unravel in a courtroom. I know what missing money looks like. I know the paper trails people leave when they think no one is watching. I retired at 62 with a pension, a house in Dayton, Ohio that my late wife Carol and I bought for $74,000 in 1991, and a kidney condition that required dialysis 3 times a week at a clinic 12 minutes from my front door. My son Daniel became a software architect. His company went public 4 years ago. He is worth, by my rough estimate based on what I've read in the financial press, somewhere between $8 and $12 million depending on the market on any given Tuesday. He is 36 years old, kind-hearted, and, as I would come to understand, dangerously trusting. His wife, my daughter-in-law, is named Renata. I had known from the beginning that Renata found me inconvenient. Not in any way she ever stated directly she was too careful for that, but in the small architecture of her behavior. The way she angled her body slightly away from me at dinner tables. The way she answered questions I hadn't asked in order to avoid the ones I had. The first time she visited my house, 3 years ago, she walked through it the way a real estate agent walks through a property she has no intention of listing. "Raymond," she said, standing in my living room with her arms crossed, "have you ever thought about one of those senior communities? The newer ones are really quite beautiful. There's one in Scottsdale that Daniel and I toured, and honestly, the amenities. I built the bookshelf in that corner," I told her. "Carol and I planted those rose bushes along the back fence in 2003. This is my home." She smiled the way people smile when they think you've said something slightly pathetic. That was 3 years ago. Since then, her mother Gloria had moved into my guest bedroom. Renata had presented this arrangement during a Christmas visit as a temporary solution to Gloria's divorce. "Just a few months, Raymond, until she finds her footing. She'll be completely self-sufficient. You won't even know she's there." Gloria was 58, healthy, and in the year and a half since she'd moved in, had demonstrated her self-sufficiency, primarily by reorganizing my kitchen cabinets, without asking, criticizing the water pressure in my shower, and treating my home as a staging area for her online shopping habit. Boxes arrived daily. She returned roughly half of them. I said very little about Gloria's presence because Daniel asked me not to make things difficult. That word difficult lodged itself somewhere in my chest and stayed there. So I was not, on the day of my birthday phone call, operating without suspicions. I had simply not yet had reason to pull the thread. "What do you mean, what money?" Daniel's voice had changed. It had gone careful, measured, the way voices go when the speaker is suddenly revising something they thought they understood. "I mean exactly that," I said. "I receive my federal pension. I receive $340 a month from the assistance program at St. Luke's Lutheran, which helps with my dialysis copays. That is the entirety of my monthly income. There has never been a deposit from you or Renata or anyone connected to either of you. Dad." His voice broke slightly on that single syllable. "I've been sending $6,000 a month for 2 years. Renata set up the account. She said she handles all our family giving through a management system so she can track everything for taxes." I picked up my spoon, set it back down. 2 years. 12 months twice over. 24 deposits of $6,000 each. I did the arithmetic the way I once did it in federal courtrooms, with a jury watching. $144,000. "Daniel," I said, keeping my voice level, "tell me the name on the account." I heard him pulling up something on his phone. the Raymond Holt Medical Support Account. She showed me the setup documents when she created it. I've seen the transfer confirmations every single month. From down the hall, I could hear Gloria watching television in the guest bedroom. Some home renovation program, the host's enthusiasm muffled by the wall between us. I have never signed paperwork for any such account, I said. I have never received a statement. I have never seen $1 of it. The silence that followed was different from the first one. Heavier. 2 weeks before that birthday call, I would not have been able to tell you anything was wrong. I knew I was poor in the way that retired people on fixed incomes are poor carefully, quietly, without drama. I rationed my groceries. I kept the thermostat at 68 in winter and used box fans in summer rather than running the central air. I had sold my good winter coat 2 years ago when the furnace needed replacing and replaced it with a cheaper one from a thrift store on Salem Avenue. My dialysis copays ran $340 a month. The church helped with that. I was grateful, and I was proud, and I did not complain. Now I sat in my kitchen understanding that while I had been rationing soup and keeping the thermostat at 68, $144,000 had been flowing somewhere else entirely. I asked Daniel to send me everything he had. Transfer confirmations, account setup documents, every communication from Renata about the account. He did. It arrived in my email within the hour. I read it all, sitting at the kitchen table, while Gloria's television murmured down the hall. The account documents showed my name. They showed my address. The signature on the opening paperwork looked like mine, the way a photocopy looks like an original, close enough to pass a casual glance, wrong in ways that would matter to a forensic examiner. I had, in fact, signed documents Renata brought me 18 months ago during a visit. She had said they were updated insurance beneficiary forms. I had started to read them, found the language dense and confusing, and she had said, gently, "Raymond, it's just routine. Your doctor's office requires it." I had signed. I sat with that memory for a long time. 31 years tracking financial fraud had taught me one thing above all others. The clearest sign of a professional theft is that the victim feels foolish for not seeing it sooner. That feeling is by design. Renata had counted on my trust in my son's wife. She had counted on my reluctance to ask Daniel for money directly. She knew I was too proud for that, and she had counted on that same pride keeping me from admitting I needed help. She had built her scheme around the precise shape of my dignity. I got up from the table, walked to my filing cabinet in the second bedroom, and pulled out the folder labeled Medical 2024. Every explanation of benefits from the dialysis clinic, every statement from my checking account, every receipt I had kept from the pharmacy, I spread them across the dining room table in chronological order and began. That is what 31 years gives you. Not anger, not panic. Method. Daniel called back that evening. His voice was shaking. "Dad." I confronted her. She said the account is a long-term medical reserve, that the money is growing for your future care. She said you're confused, and that you agreed to this arrangement yourself. "Daniel," I said, "I would like you to ask her, in writing text message, email, anything that creates a record to provide the account number and the current balance." Why in writing? Because when she refuses or deflects, you will have documentation that she refused. A pause. You already know she's going to refuse. I know what the pattern looks like. I spent 3 decades watching it. He sent the text. She did not provide the account number. She said the account information was managed through our family financial advisor and that she would pull it together when things were less hectic. She sent that response at 11:47 at night. I have the screenshot. I did not sleep well. But I got up at 5 in the morning the way I always have, made coffee, and sat down at my dining room table with a legal pad. I called the bank I use for my personal checking. The representative confirmed what I already suspected. I had no secondary accounts, no trust accounts, nothing beyond my standard checking and savings. I was not listed as a beneficiary or account holder anywhere in their system beyond what I already knew about. I called a second bank, one I had never used, on the theory that Renata might have opened the account somewhere she had an existing relationship. No record. I called Daniel. She opened it at First Pacific, he said. He had looked at his own transfer history and traced the receiving institution. I called them this morning. They said because you're the trust namesake but not the account manager, you have no access rights. There it was. The same structure I had seen in embezzlement cases, where an employee creates a charitable fund in a donor's name and lists themselves as sole signatory. Clean on the surface, theft underneath. I called an attorney. Her name was Patricia Owens. She had a small office on Salem Avenue, 3 blocks from the thrift store where I had bought my winter coat. Her waiting room had mismatched chairs and motivational posters and smelled like old coffee. And she looked at my documentation with the focused attention of someone who had seen this before, but not quite at this scale. "You built this yourself?" she said, looking at my spreadsheets. 31 years as a federal forensic accountant. She looked up. Something shifted in her expression, the professional recalculation that happens when a potential client turns out to be more useful than expected. "You understand the likely recovery options better than most of my colleagues. Walk me through the Ohio statutes," I said. "I want to hear your analysis." We spent 2 hours together. Civil suit for unjust enrichment, constructive trust claim, conversion of designated funds, and for Gloria ejectment under Ohio property law. No lease. No written agreement. No rent paid in 18 months of occupancy. The law was clear. Patricia's contingency rate was 30% of recovery. Her upfront retainer was $400. I wrote the check and watched my savings account drop to $31 before Daniel, that same evening, wired me $5,000 for whatever you need, Dad. No strings, just please use it. I used $400 of it for the retainer. The rest went into an envelope in my filing cabinet labeled Emergency. 3 days after I retained Patricia, Renata called my cell phone at 7 in the morning. I let it ring through to voicemail. She left no message. She called again that afternoon. I answered. Raymond. Her voice was warm, in the way that voices are warm when they are working. "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Daniel is very upset and I want to clear this up before it becomes something it shouldn't be." "I'm listening," I said. "The account I set up is for your future care. It's structured as a tax-advantaged medical reserve. The money is completely safe, and it's all for you. I was managing it because, and please don't take this the wrong way, your health situation is complicated, and I wanted to make sure the funds were protected properly." "Renata," I said, "provide the account number and current balance by end of business today. I'll need to talk to our financial advisor. End of business today." I repeated, and ended the call. She did not provide the number. Instead, she called Daniel and told him I had been hostile and that she was worried about my cognitive health. I know this because Daniel called me an hour later, confused and apologetic. "She's saying you seemed disoriented on the phone, that you repeated yourself." I had, in fact, repeated myself. Deliberately. "Daniel," I said, "I want you to do something for me. Look at your own bank records for the past 2 years and tell me what the line items say for those monthly transfers." He looked. He called back in 20 minutes. "They say, Raymond Holt, medical support. Every one of them." "Now tell me," I said, "whether you ever once called me to ask how the medical support was going, whether the account was adequate, whether I needed more." The pause stretched. "I trusted her to manage it," he said quietly. "I know you did. I'm not blaming you, son. I'm building a record." 2 days later, I returned home from dialysis to find my dining room in partial disarray. The papers I had organized chronologically across my dining room table had been shuffled. Not dramatically, nothing thrown or destroyed, but moved, subtly rearranged. Enough that someone unfamiliar with my filing system might not notice. I noticed. Gloria was in the kitchen making tea. "Did someone come in here while I was at the clinic?" I asked. She shrugged without turning around. "I dusted a little. Your papers were everywhere." I photographed the current state of the table from 3 angles. Texted the photos to Patricia with a note. "Guest in home. Accessing documents. Recommend accelerating eviction filing. Patricia filed the ejectment action the following morning. I also moved my original documents, the unsigned insurance forms Renata had left behind, my pension records, my deed to the fireproof document box I had kept since my government days. I locked it, placed it in my bedroom closet behind a stack of Carol's old books. Let Gloria report whatever she had seen. The copies could be shuffled all she liked. Daniel flew to Dayton the following weekend. He sat at my dining room table for 3 hours going through everything I had compiled. He was quiet in the way that people are quiet when the evidence is so clear that arguing would be embarrassing. She's been telling me for 2 years that you were well taken care of, he said finally. That you didn't want to talk about money because it made you uncomfortable. That you preferred she handle everything quietly so you could maintain your dignity. That word again. Dignity. She had studied me precisely enough to use my own values as the mechanism of my exploitation. She knew I wouldn't ask you directly, I said. She knew I would rather go without than admit I needed help. She designed the whole arrangement around that. Daniel put his face in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red. I've been sending $6,000 a month for 2 years thinking you were using it for treatment. I know, son. I should have called you. I should have asked. Yes. But the person responsible for this is not you. I handed him a folder. Take this to your divorce attorney in Seattle. I've organized it the same way I organized federal embezzlement cases. Timeline, transactions, correspondence, structural analysis. Your attorney will know what to do with it. He looked at the folder. You want me to file for divorce? I want you to protect yourself and protect your daughter. What you do with the marriage is between you and your conscience. But if you're going to fight, fight with documentation. He took the folder home. 2 days later, he filed. Renata's response was immediate and, I will admit, better coordinated than I expected. She retained a Seattle family law firm, expensive, aggressive, and within a week had filed an emergency motion, claiming Daniel was acting under the undue influence of an elderly parent with documented cognitive decline. She attached a signed statement from Gloria. I read Gloria's affidavit sitting at my kitchen table. According to Gloria, I had become increasingly forgetful over the past year, had accused her of stealing small household items, had repeated myself in conversation, and had demonstrated paranoid ideation about my finances. I called Patricia. They're going to try to have you evaluated, she said. Standard playbook. Attack your credibility before your evidence reaches a judge. Schedule the evaluation, I said. The sooner the better. The neuropsychological evaluation took place at Miami Valley Hospital. 3 hours of memory assessments, logic sequences, pattern recognition, verbal reasoning. The examiner was thorough and impersonal and professional. The results came back 1 week later. I scored in the 91st percentile for my age group in working memory. Above average across every measured category. No evidence of cognitive impairment, dementia, or any condition affecting judgment or reasoning. The written report used the phrase exceptional cognitive preservation in the summary paragraph. I carried 3 notarized copies to Patricia's office and kept one in the fireproof box. Patricia filed our civil complaint the same week. Unjust enrichment. $144,000. Principal plus interest. Constructive trust. Court. Ordered return of wrongfully held assets. Conversion. Unauthorized use of designated medical funds. Total demand, including interest and legal fees, $198,000. We also, on Patricia's recommendation, filed a report with the Ohio Attorney General's Elder Financial Exploitation Unit. Civil proceedings were our primary track, but creating an official state record would matter if Renata attempted to restructure assets before judgment. The process server delivered our complaint to Renata at her Seattle office on a Tuesday afternoon. She called me that evening. I put my phone on speaker and pressed record on the digital recorder I had used for 3 decades of federal interviews, still in perfect working order in my home office drawer. You are destroying this family, she said. Her voice had lost its warmth entirely, like a switch had been thrown. Daniel will never forgive you. You will die alone in that house, and no one will come. I let her speak for 4 minutes. Threats, accusations, a brief pivot to tearful appeals, more threats. When she paused for breath, I said, "You deposited $144,000 that was designated for my medical care into an account I had no access to and spent it on yourself. The courts will address that." I ended the call. The recording was 47 seconds of her voice and 1 sentence of mine. I emailed it to Patricia that night. 3 weeks later, discovery began. Patricia subpoenaed First Pacific Bank for the complete transaction history of the Raymond Holt Medical Support account. The statements arrived in a sealed court envelope. I sat with Patricia in her conference room, and we read through them together. The account had received $144,000 across 24 months. The withdrawals told their story with the clarity that financial records always do when no one has thought to obscure them carefully enough. $23,400 in spa and beauty treatments. $31,000 in clothing purchases, multiple high-end retailers. $18,500 in restaurant charges, including 14 visits to a single Seattle restaurant where the average check, I confirmed online, was $300 per person. $22,000 in travel. 2 international trips, 1 to Portugal, 1 to Japan. $11,000 in home decor purchases. Various cash withdrawals totaling $15,800. A $4,200 charge to a personal trainer. The remaining $18,100 distributed across dozens of smaller charges, none of which bore any relationship to dialysis, nephrology, medication, or any other medical purpose. Not $1. In 24 months of deposits designated for my kidney disease, not a single withdrawal touched healthcare. Patricia called the forensic accountant she used for complex cases. His name was Thomas Webb. He was 61, meticulous, and produced a 40-page analysis that categorized every transaction and stated his professional conclusion with the directness I had come to appreciate in people who work with evidence for a living. The account funds were used exclusively for the personal benefit of the account manager. 0 expenditures correlate with the stated purpose of the trust. The case went to hearing in the spring. The judge was a former prosecutor named Wallace Briggs, who had the bearing of someone who had been lied to in court enough times to develop an efficient mechanism for detecting it. Renata testified in her own behalf. She wore modest clothing and spoke about her genuine care for my well-being and her sincere belief that a managed reserve fund was the most responsible approach to long-term medical planning. She said the spending was administrative and related to the management overhead of running a family financial support structure. Patricia cross-examined her for 40 minutes. The Portugal trip, the Japan trip, the 14 dinners at the $300 a check restaurant, the personal trainer, the cash withdrawals with no corresponding documentation. By the end, Renata had contradicted herself on the stand 3 times and had been unable to name a single medical expenditure the account had covered in 24 months. Judge Briggs issued his ruling 6 weeks later. I was at my kitchen table doing a crossword puzzle when Patricia called. I put down my pen. "We won everything," she said. The judgment was specific and total. Renata was ordered to pay $144,000 in principal, $21,600 in interest, and $14,000 in court costs and expert fees. Total, 170. Nu. 6 cents. The counter-claim against me, defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, was dismissed with prejudice. I read the full ruling at the library that afternoon, standing at the printer the way I had stood at it on so many earlier days, feeding quarters into the machine and watching pages accumulate. 14 pages. I read every word. The court found that Renata had systematically diverted funds designated for the plaintiff's medical care for personal enrichment over a period of 24 months, demonstrating deliberate deception and conscious disregard for the plaintiff's documented medical needs. It found her testimony not credible and contradicted at multiple points by documentary evidence and her own written communications. I folded the pages, placed them in my worn leather folder. walked out into a spring afternoon that smelled like cut grass and someone's backyard grill. The ejectment hearing had come earlier, in February. Judge Sandra Morley had listened to Gloria's testimony about her caregiving contributions with the patient skepticism of someone reviewing a story for internal consistency. When Patricia asked Gloria to detail the medical care she had provided, Gloria mentioned general support and companionship. When Patricia asked whether she had ever administered medication, driven me to dialysis, or assisted with any medical procedure, the answer was no to all three. Judge Morley ruled from the bench. Gloria had no lease, no written agreement, no legal right to occupancy. She was ordered to vacate within 60 days. Gloria left in March, relocating to Seattle to stay with her daughter. She left a note on the kitchen counter. "Hope you're happy, Raymond. Some people have no gratitude." She also left behind 3 boxes of returned merchandise she had never gotten around to shipping back, and a collection of scented candles in my bathroom that I threw away that same afternoon. I spent the rest of that day cleaning, scrubbing surfaces, washing windows, reclaiming rooms. By evening, the house smelled like dish soap and fresh air and itself again. The way it had smelled when Carol was alive and the two of us rattled around its 4 rooms in comfortable companionship. I made scrambled eggs, ate at my own kitchen table without commentary. When the court enforcement orders went out, First Pacific Bank froze Renata's accounts. She had $89,000 across her personal accounts at the time of the freeze, transferred to court control immediately. The remaining balance was satisfied through the forced liquidation of assets. Designer clothing auction through a resale service for $34,000, jewelry for $28,000, and proceeds from the forfeiture of a vacation property deposit she had placed using funds traced to the account. Patricia called with the final accounting in late summer. Total collected: $186,400. After my contingency, your net recovery is $130,000. She paused. That's nearly what was stolen, Raymond. These cases don't usually recover this completely. We documented everything, I said. That is why. Daniel's divorce was finalized in July. The prenuptial agreement he had signed before the wedding, which Renata had apparently never taken seriously, protected his company stock, his primary investments, and the Seattle house entirely. She received $80,000, half of their joint savings accumulated during the marriage, and nothing else. The fraud judgment against her, now public record, had destroyed any sympathy she might have drawn from a family court judge. The custody evaluation for their son Marcus, who was 4 years old and had his father's dark eyes and his father's patient way of considering things before he spoke, concluded that Renata had engaged in deliberate parental alienation and coached the child in his responses to evaluators. Daniel received primary custody. Renata received supervised visitation on alternating weekends. I learned all of this over a series of phone calls during which my son's voice slowly shed the hollow, exhausted quality it had carried for most of that year, and began to sound, gradually, like himself again. He flew to Dayton with Marcus in August. I was on my front porch when the rental car pulled up a practical sedan, nothing like the luxury vehicles Renata had preferred. Daniel got out first, and then opened the rear door, and Marcus climbed out and looked at my house with the frank appraisal of a 4-year-old deciding how he feels about a new place. Then he looked at me. "Grandpa," he said, with the confidence of a child who has been told about someone enough times to feel he already knows them, and walked up my front steps. I lifted him, my back registering its opinion of this decision, and held on anyway. We spent the day the way I had hoped we would spend it. Slowly, without agenda, moving at whatever pace a 4-year-old sets. I showed Marcus the rose bushes along the back fence, told him his grandmother had planted them. He listened with the solemn attention children give to things they understand are important without fully understanding why. That evening, after Marcus had fallen asleep in the guest bedroom, clean now, entirely reclaimed, smelling of fresh sheets and lavender detergent rather than Gloria's scented candles, Daniel and I sat on the back porch in the warm August dark. He held his coffee mug in both hands and looked at Carol's rose bushes and said, "I'm sorry I didn't check. I know. She told me you'd be embarrassed if I asked directly." that you'd see it as charity. I believed her. Because he stopped. Because it was true, I said. She knew me well enough to use the right key on the right lock. I should have checked anyway. You trusted your wife. That's what marriage asks of you. I looked at the rose bushes. Carol had planted the red ones along the left side and the yellow ones along the right. Some system of organization she had in mind that I had never fully understood and had never disturbed. When you found out the truth, you didn't make excuses. You didn't ask me to drop anything. You stood where you needed to stand. Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist in the dark, thinking, I couldn't see. The money, I said. I have specific plans for it. He started to protest that I should keep it. Use it for myself. Something comfortable, and I let him finish before I continued. Marcus's education, I said. All of it, structured as a trust, with you as trustee until he's 25. Patricia already drafted the documents. I signed them last week. Dad, your mother and I went without things so you could have every opportunity. That was the best use we ever made of money. This is the same thing, just with a longer runway. I looked at him. It's also the appropriate use of funds that were designated from the beginning for family care. They're going to family care. Just the right generation. He didn't argue anymore. He sat with it for a while, in the way he has always sat with things quietly, thoroughly, and then he nodded. Patricia's final accounting put Marcus's education trust at $127,000 after fees. Invested conservatively, she and the estate planning attorney both projected it reaching somewhere between $240,000 and $280,000 by the time he was college age. Enough for 4 years anywhere he chose, with room left over. Renata was living in a studio apartment in Tacoma. She had lost her position at the nonprofit board she had joined with money from the account. The fraud judgment was public record, and boards of directors conduct background checks. She was working in retail. Her social media accounts, which had documented years of carefully curated luxury, had been deleted. Former friends from the charity circuit, I was told through Daniel, did not return her calls. I know this not with any pleasure in mind, but because knowing it means she cannot reach us. Distance and consequence are their own form of protection. I spent the last week of August repainting my front porch. The old paint had been flaking for 2 years, one of the maintenance items I had deferred during the lean period, which now seemed like something I could address. I bought supplies from the hardware store, did the work myself over 3 days, moving slowly and resting when I needed to, which was more often than I would have preferred. The new paint was white, bright and clean in particular, the color Carol had always wanted, and which I had never gotten around to applying while she was alive. Better late than honest intention ever goes to waste. I sat on that freshly painted porch on a September evening with a cup of coffee. I was only halfway through and a photograph on my phone Daniel and Marcus at the zoo. Both of them laughing at something outside the frame, their faces open and unguarded in the way that faces look when no one is performing anything. The dialysis clinic called that afternoon to confirm my Thursday appointment. I confirmed it. My copay, covered by Street Luke's assistance program, was $340. My kidney function, my specialist told me at my last visit, was holding stable. I was managing. My house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when the people in them belong there. Carol's rose bushes were doing well along the back fence, the red ones and the yellow ones in their arrangement that I had never fully understood. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the street. The September air carried the first suggestion of autumn. I had not recovered everything that was taken from me. 2 years of medical worry I had carried alone. 2 years of soup rationed in a cold kitchen, while $6,000 a month moved to another woman's closet and dinner tables. The cost of a good winter coat I had sold to pay a heating bill. Those things do not appear in a court judgment. But Marcus would have his education. Daniel would rebuild his life on ground that was honest. My house was mine in every room. And justice, when you build it carefully enough from evidence gathered one piece at a time, has a way of being exactly as complete as the case you make for it. I set my coffee down on the wicker table, looked at Carol's roses in the fading light, finished the crossword I had started that morning. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today.